Okay, so you folks sent us some pretty intense stuff this time around.
Yeah.
And it's about this idea of wiping out HIV,
Right.
which is obviously a huge challenge.
It is a huge challenge.
So I guess our goal here in this deep dive is
Uh-huh.
to really dig into what these sources are saying
Sure.
about how someone would even start to tackle something like this.
Absolutely.
So let's see. Looks like we have an article called Wiping Out HIV
Yep.
by Kay Warren.
Right.
And I think that was originally published in Christianity Today.
It was, yeah, and that was back in 2008.
Okay.
And then also we've got some excerpts here from Rick Warren where
Oh, yeah.
he's talking about the church and how it's equipped to
Yeah.
handle global issues like this.
Okay, so just for context, Kay Warren and Rick Warren,
Right.
they are the co-founders of Saddleback Church, right?
Yeah, they are, yeah.
And Kay Warren, she's been, really leading the charge there
Yeah.
when it comes to fighting HIV and AIDS.
Absolutely. And she's been doing that since like 2003.
All right, so she's been at it for a while.
Yeah, for a while.
And then Rick Warren, obviously, senior pastor of Saddleback,
Right.
and also the guy behind the Peace Plan,
Yes, that's right.
which is all about getting churches and Christians
Yeah.
involved in these global problems.
Mobilized and, out there actually doing stuff.
Okay, so maybe we should start with Kay Warren's perspective.
Yeah.
In the article, she talks about this moment
Mhm.
where she really kind of had a wake-up call
Right.
about 5 years before she wrote the piece.
Yes.
And she says she was seriously disturbed.
Right.
So what was it that kind of triggered this really strong reaction in her?
Well, it's actually pretty interesting how something so simple
Yeah.
could have such a big impact.
Yeah.
She was reading this magazine article about the AIDS pandemic in Africa
Oh, wow.
and just the enormity of it.
Right.
It just hit her hard.
Yeah.
Like the article is talking about over 30 million people living with HIV
Yeah.
and 12 million children
Yeah.
who had been orphaned because of the disease.
Yeah. I mean, those are just staggering numbers.
They are, and it's not just numbers, For her, it was like this wave of shock and horror,
Yeah.
realizing the scale of suffering
Right.
that was happening that she had been completely oblivious to.
Yeah. You can see how that would be so disturbing.
Absolutely.
Like, it's not just an intellectual thing anymore. It's
Yeah.
like this deeply personal realization
Oh, yeah.
of just this huge tragedy unfolding.
Yeah.
And she mentions in the article these really specific questions that really stuck with her.
Yes.
She's like, how could all these people be infected?
Right.
And I don't even know one of them.
Yeah.
How could there be so many orphans?
Yeah.
And I can't name a single one.
It just brings it home, right?
It really does. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
it takes this global problem
Yeah.
and makes it suddenly very real and very human.
Absolutely.
And it's not like she just sat with this feeling of being disturbed.
Right.
She actually turned it into action.
Yeah.
Like she became really passionate about actually doing something.
Exactly.
The article makes it clear that they weren't just aiming
Mhm.
to manage the AIDS crisis
No,
to kind of
yeah.
contain it.
Right.
They were talking about actually wiping it out completely.
Completely eliminating it.
Yeah, like they had done with other major diseases
Yeah.
like cancer and tuberculosis.
Exactly.
So that ambition is a really important part of their whole approach.
It's a core part of their thinking.
Okay, so then the article introduces this really compelling story
Mm-hmm.
about a guy named David Miller.
Right.
How did he end up crossing paths with them?
Well, Rick Warren met David at a conference in New York.
Okay.
And David comes across as, a pretty tough guy.
Yeah.
He was a Marine Corps veteran.
Okay.
And he'd been living with AIDS for like 20 years at that point.
Wow.
He was also heavily involved with ACTUP.
Okay, and remind me what ACTUP is again.
It's an advocacy group based in New York.
Okay.
And they were really vocal in their protests about the response to the AIDS epidemic.
Gotcha.
In fact, David had been arrested over 200 times
Wow.
in those kinds of protests.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so when he met Rick, the first thing he said to him was,
Yeah.
where was the church when I needed help?
Oh, wow. That's intense.
It is. It's really direct.
Yeah, and it speaks to a lot of pain and feeling abandoned.
Absolutely. A lot of hurt there.
So how did Rick Warren respond to that?
Well, his response was really immediate
Yeah.
and maybe a little unexpected.
Okay.
He basically said, I'm sorry. He asked for forgiveness for any hurt
Yeah.
that Christians or people acting in the name of Christ
All right.
had caused David.
Yeah.
And the article says that David was really taken aback by this.
Yeah, I can imagine.
He actually physically recoiled.
Wow.
It seems like that moment was really a turning point for them.
Yeah.
It led to them talking for hours.
Oh.
And Rick ended up inviting David to come to their global summit.
Okay, the Global Summit on AIDS and the church.
Yeah, exactly. And these summits were a big deal.
Right.
Saddleback Church would bring together
Yeah.
all these faith leaders and medical professionals and activists to talk about the AIDS pandemic and figure out how to address it.
So David actually agreed to go to the summit.
He did, which is pretty amazing considering how hostile he was at first.
Yeah, it really is. So how did he behave at the summit?
Well, at first he was still very much in protest mode.
Okay.
Like he was really critical of the government and pharmaceutical companies and politicians.
Right.
He was obviously carrying a lot of anger and resentment.
Sure.
But as the summit was ending,
Yeah.
he did join this group of HIV-positive men and women
Okay.
who were going up on stage to receive prayer.
Okay, so maybe a little bit of a shift there.
Yeah, a little bit, even though he wasn't
Oh.
totally ready to embrace a different perspective.
Okay, so it sounds like it was a gradual process
Definitely.
of building trust.
Absolutely.
The article says that even after the summit, David was still saying that he didn't think he could ever stop hating the people he felt had failed him. So what did Kay and Rick Warren do to kind of keep that relationship going?
Well, they were really committed to staying connected with him.
Okay.
They didn't just invite him to the summit and then forget about him. They
Right.
called him, they emailed him,
Yeah.
they sent him resources that they thought might be helpful.
Okay.
And Kay Warren even went to visit him
Wow.
in his neighborhood in the Bronx.
Wow, in the Bronx.
Yeah, and that visit seems to have been really significant.
Yeah, the article describes her going to the Bronx
Mm-hmm.
and how David, even though he was, this tough guy,
Right.
he was really concerned about the people in his community. He was pointing out the crack houses
Yeah.
and just the really tough environment he was living in.
It really gives you some context for his anger and his background.
It does. It makes you understand where he's coming from.
Yeah.
And there's this moment where he says to Kay,
Mm.
I can't believe you came here.
Yeah.
And that just speaks volumes, I think.
It does. It shows how much that personal outreach meant to him.
Yeah, like it started to break down some of those walls he had built up.
Absolutely.
And it seems like that led to this really important moment
Mm-hmm.
where David started to think,
Yeah.
well, if the Warrens can care about me like this,
Right. Right.
maybe God's love is real too.
It's a huge shift in perspective.
It is. It shows how just showing up for someone
Yeah.
and caring for them can open them up
Mm.
to exploring their spirituality.
Absolutely.
And so this kind of softening continued.
Right.
And by the time the 2006 Global Summit happened,
Yeah.
David wasn't as openly hostile anymore,
Right.
although he was still cautious.
He was still a little guarded.
Yeah. And then on World AIDS Day after that summit,
Mm-hmm.
Rick Warren led David to faith in Jesus Christ.
Yes. The article describes it as this collision
Wow.
of his his experience with AIDS
Right.
and this newfound faith.
Okay, so it wasn't like a, fairy tale conversion or anything.
Yeah. No, it was a real process.
Yeah.
With its own challenges.
The article talks about how David,
Mm-hmm.
with his, Bronx accent, as they put it,
Right.
started talking about these struggles he was having with being a Christian.
So what kinds of struggles?
Well, he said he couldn't just dismiss people he disagreed with anymore.
Okay.
He had to see them as, human beings created by God.
That's a big change.
It is. And he also really struggled with the idea of loving his enemies.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one.
It is. But it's those kind of honest details
Mm,
that make his transformation so believable
I agree.
and impactful.
Yeah.
And then the article talks about him speaking at the 2007 Global Summit.
Right. Giving his testimony.
Yeah, and then getting baptized on World AIDS Day.
That's right. Rick baptized him.
Yeah.
And David was just trembling and overwhelmed with emotion.
Yeah.
And afterwards, he's just weeping with joy, hugging Rick.
Wow.
But it doesn't end there.
No.
This other Marine had been so moved by David's story.
That he asked David to baptize him right then and there.
Wow. So the guy who used to be protesting the system
Right.
is now baptizing someone.
It's pretty powerful.
It really is. It's like this full circle moment.
Absolutely.
And Kay Warren, she connects this whole transformation
Yeah.
back to this idea of making the invisible God visible
Yeah.
through acts of service and acceptance.
Right.
It wasn't just about, abstract theological concepts.
Oh.
It was about showing David love and support in a real way.
Meeting his needs on a practical level
Exact.
and on a spiritual level.
Okay, so that's Kay Warren's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Rick Warren, he has this whole other angle
Right.
about the role of the church in tackling global issues.
Exactly.
He basically says that the church is the most magnificent concept ever created.
He does say that.
And the greatest force on the face of the earth.
Strong words.
They are. So what are his reasons for believing that?
Well, he lays out three main arguments.
Yeah. The first one is about the sheer size and reach of the church.
Okay.
He calls it the largest participation and the widest distribution.
Okay, so what does he mean by that?
Well, he's pointing out that there are over 2 billion Christians worldwide.
Right.
And that means the church has a presence pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
Even in remote villages,
Right.
places that other organizations might not be able to reach.
Okay, so just in terms of manpower,
Yeah,
they've got a huge advantage.
absolutely.
Okay, what's his second argument?
His second point is about motivation.
Okay.
He says that the Great Commandment,
And that's to love God and love your neighbor.
that's right,
Okay.
that commandment is a really powerful motivator.
Okay.
It's not about money or fame.
Right.
It's about love and service.
And that can sustain people
Yeah,
through the really tough work
exactly.
of tackling these huge global problems.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what's his third argument?
His third reason has to do with how the church is organized, or maybe more accurately, how it's not organized.
Okay.
He talks about the simplest administration.
Okay, so what's he getting at there?
He's saying that the church can network and mobilize really quickly
Right.
without a lot of bureaucracy.
Okay.
He uses Saddleback Church as an example.
Yeah.
He says they encourage their members
Mm-hmm.
to use their talents and passions
Nice.
to address the issues that they care about.
Right.
And they don't have to go through tons of committees or
Yeah.
get a bunch of approvals.
Right.
In fact, he says they don't even have a single committee that
Yeah.
people need to join to get involved in ministry.
So it's all about empowering individuals.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting because on the one hand,
Yeah.
it's like that grassroots energy can be really effective.
Right.
But on the other hand, I guess you have to wonder
Mm-hmm.
about accountability
That's true.
and consistency.
Yeah. You don't want things to become chaotic.
Right, and these sources don't really get into that.
No, they don't.
Okay, so back to Rick Warren.
Yeah.
He mentions the peace plan
Mm-hmm.
as a way for churches to get involved in these global challenges.
He does.
But he also says that other plans are fine too.
Right.
It's more about being intentional
Yes.
and having a strategy.
Exactly.
Okay, and he acknowledges that sometimes these problems can feel overwhelming,
Right.
like they're just too big to solve.
Absolutely.
And what does he say to that?
He basically challenges people to think about
Yeah.
what could happen if millions of people in millions of churches
Yeah.
all started praying and preparing themselves and then taking action.
Okay.
He believes that could lead to this huge explosion of ministry.
Okay, so it's about tapping into the collective power of the church.
Exactly.
And then he uses this really powerful analogy of
Yeah.
David and Goliath.
Right.
He's suggesting that even these massive challenges, like wiping out HIV,
Yeah.
can be overcome
Right.
if the church works together and is obedient to God.
It's a message of hope and empowerment.
It is. So it all comes back to this idea that these sources are presenting,
Right.
where wiping out HIV isn't just a medical problem
Yeah.
or a government problem.
It's a human problem
It's a human problem.
and a spiritual problem.
And they're saying that the church
Yeah.
can play a huge role in solving it
Absolutely.
by addressing both the physical and spiritual needs of people.
Exactly.
So just to kind of recap,
Mm-hmm.
we've looked at Kay Warren's personal journey,
Right.
her realization of the scale of the HIV crisis, and then we heard the amazing story of David Miller
Right.
and how he was transformed through this connection and care.
Through love and support.
Yeah. And then we looked at Rick Warren's argument for why the church is so well equipped
Right.
to handle global issues like this.
Yeah.
David's story is really powerful
It is.
because it shows the kind of impact that Rick Warren thinks the church can have on a much larger scale.
Absolutely.
And the big takeaway here seems to be
Yeah.
that it's not enough to just talk about God.
Right.
You have to actually show God's love through concrete actions.
Through service and acceptance.
Through meeting people's needs, both physically and spiritually.
Right.
And that kind of genuine care can really break down barriers
It can.
and heal people.
It's a powerful message.
It is.
Yeah.
So this has been a really fascinating deep
It
dive
has.
into a really unique perspective on tackling a global crisis.
Yeah.
And it leaves us with a question for you, our listener.
Okay.
What role do you think individuals or communities, regardless of their background or their beliefs, can play in facing these huge challenges that we see in the world today?
It's something to think about.
It is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.